this talk, it's not about putting any religious burden on you. I saw a pamphlet that was just randomly in my pocket as I was doing my laundry today, and it was a pamphlet that somebody gave me recently who was a Christian, and I'm sure they had great intentions, but they were giving out these pamphlets to basically say, oh, you think you're a good person, but a good person is not really going to get into heaven. You have to do much more than that. And although I might agree with their sentiment in that we can always grow more into understanding more about God and experiencing heaven here and now. The now is the only moment that God ever makes. There are many nows, but it's always now. The past and future, those are just hypothetical moments. And yet, I don't think there's a different experience in the future that's called heaven or hell. It's always in the now, and we can experience it instantaneously here and now. And when I read that little pamphlet I found in my pocket, I was feeling a bit of a burden, like, oh my gosh, I got to do all these things, and then way in the future, I could experience heaven. I hope this lecture, it's a little bit different. In fact, before I started this live stream, I just opened up my Bible at random just to get some inspiration. And I opened up to this little passage in the 9th chapter of John, and it's where Jesus heals a blind man. And it says, as he went along, he saw a blind man from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And the conception at the time was if something wrong was happening to somebody, it must be because of sin. But listen to what Jesus said. He said, neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in his life. And Jesus, of course, healed this blind man, and he said it happened so that the works of God might be displayed in his life. And throughout the Bible, there's this wonderful phrase about the signs and wonders of God, just about God being displayed in everyday people's lives. And every week, I experience some wonderful thing, a sign and wonder of God. Just a little fun thing this week. I was down at this tidal river that I live along when I'm up here in Maine. And I saw a little seal. Seals are usually very shy, but this seal was very curious, and he was playing with a little puppy dog, a friend's puppy of a friend that I have that has this little dog. And I just caught this on film, this little seal kissing this dog here. And they were so cute together. I just caught the little last minute here of this interaction. But it was just such a wonderful little moment of these two creatures playfully enjoying each other, and just for a moment there, uniting. And I just thought that was such a lovely moment. And yet I'm going to share today about the wonders and signs of God that are so much more than just, two animals uniting. I'm going to talk about how we can feel totally united with God, with infinite divine love, in such a way that we can really see incredible good all around us, health and joy and connection like we could probably not even imagine from a materialistic everyday standpoint. So I want to talk about prayer, and the first thing I should share about prayer is that there's this common symbol for prayer. It's someone down on their knees, their eyes are closed, and their hands are folded. And that's what most people think of when they think of prayer. And actually, I think that symbol is quite amazing. It's really telling. It really points at or symbolizes something quite profound and correct about prayer. What does it symbolize to be down on our knees? I think that's about humility. Now, if you read your Bible, Jesus is recorded in this book saying that I can of my own self do nothing. Nothing. I think more than anyone who ever lived, Jesus really understood that as an isolated mortal, as someone separate from God, he couldn't do anything for lasting good, nor witness it. But understanding his oneness with God, he could experience all good, that nothing was impossible. In fact, Jesus said, with God, all things are possible. And So that sense of getting down on one's knees, that's about humility. Now, I was talking to some members of this sponsoring branch who sponsored this talk, and they were saying in Australia it's a very secular society, and much of the world is going in that direction right now. And a lot of times people feel like, oh, well, just when you're talking about God or oneness with God, that's kind of abstract, it's an opium for the masses kind of thing. It might bring you a nice feeling if you think about that, but it's not actually true. That concept of God, we've moved beyond that in our scientific age. Well, what do I mean about, saying that I can of my own self do nothing without God? I think of God just as synonymous with life. Now, I can't do anything without life, right? I am not an isolated individual separate from life. If air disappeared around me and the water disappeared around me and the trees and the sky, I wouldn't be anything without them, right? I couldn't survive without them. There is something that is even creating this moment and everything around us, including us, and it's not an individual human psyche or mind. If we just step back for a moment, no matter what standpoint you're coming into this lecture with, I hope you can agree with that. There's something outside of ourselves that's creating and sustaining us. And we're a part of this thing that we can call life. Now, where it starts to get interesting is how many lives are there? Well, we usually think of my life and your life and that life over there, but I think we're all a part of one life, right? That we're all in this life and we're all of it. Well, I think of God as life. And God also is talked about in the Bible as love itself. Now, the moments that I've felt really at one with life, I would describe the exact experience of that with that word love. Love is a feeling of unity. And so that's why I think when the prayer symbol has these hands coming together, it's not a division, not life out there and me, little mortal, over here, something separate, but there's a oneness there. And in that oneness, the experience of that, the feeling of that, we call love. If you have two people and they feel separate, you might call that hate or division, divisiveness. But if you feel totally at one with someone, you feel in love with them. Well, sometimes people feel in love with one person or one little thing, but this lecture is about how to feel in love with life, with the thing that's creating and sustaining us. Now, that's life and that's truth. I'm sorry, we covered life and love there, but another word I'm going to use for God is truth itself. Now, we live in a world where things seem to be very subjective. People talk about my truth and your truth. But I think it's easy to agree that there is universal truth. Take the numbers, for example. 2 plus 2 equals 4. That is universal truth. It's not true just for me or people way around the world in Australia. It's true for everybody. And it transcends even time and space. You can't think of any time that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is not true. It doesn't matter how fast you're going, right? It doesn't change. Now, Einstein in his life realized that matter and time are relative, but that fact that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is not relative. It's universal and it's true in all conditions, regardless of time and space, which, time and space do change and the appearance of matter changes. But that simple equation, it's true everywhere. There is universal truth. Now, if I was to represent those numbers, like 2 plus 2 equals 4 on a chalkboard, maybe if we got going really fast, the chalk would fade away, and a material representation of that truth can change. But the truth that 2 plus 2 equals 4, that's an idea, that's a concept that applies to everyone, that's useful for everyone. And so today I'm going to talk about universal, eternal concepts. If you have an eternal concept that's true, that's fundamental to life, that's an idea, well, what creates ideas? A mind. And no one human mind created 2 plus 2 equals 4. And since it's an eternal truth, in other words, for something to be eternal, it's not subject to time or space. It's just true always, in the now, at all times. Well, if that's true, then that eternal idea needs to be created by an eternal mind, because every idea is created by a mind. But since the mind is not one of our minds, I think we could say it's the one mind, or God. And so when I'm talking about God today, this is universal stuff. I think it's very logical that there's one mind, one love, one life, and one essentially universal truth. That's what we're going to explore today. Now, back to that prayer symbol, we got that down on the knees, humility, we got those hands coming together in oneness, but there's also the closing of one's eyes. What does that represent, closing one's eyes? I think it's blocking out our material view of things, because we often conclude what is true by just seeing or feeling something. And we just assume that our physical senses tell us the truth, unless we discover otherwise. And that is what has caused basic misconceptions throughout reality. If you study history, one thing that's just crystal clear is that in every age, people had some fundamental hypothesis about life or understanding of life that was later proved to be completely wrong. Like, for example, for much of human history, people believed, at least a large swath of them, believed that the earth was flat, because you go out to the ocean and you see basically a flat horizon line. And yet, we discovered that the world is not slightly different than how our physical senses represent it. It's actually totally different. It's a sphere. The earth is a sphere. And how do we know that the earth is a sphere or a spheroid? One way is by getting a bigger view of it. If we're, from our little earthly myopic standpoint, yeah, things are going to appear flat around us a lot of the time. But if we lift ourselves up, get up to the heavens, so to speak, so far outside of the Earth's atmosphere altogether, you could look down upon the Earth and see that beautiful, sphere. I've never been up to outer space. I don't think any of us have. But that picture from astronauts really is just quite stunning and beautiful. And if you ever saw the Earth from that vantage point, you would never say, oh, the earth looks ugly today. And so often in our lives, it feels like things have fallen flat. We look out with our physical senses, we listen to things on the news, and it seems like life has fallen flat with sin and sickness and disease. And we might want to see the wonders of God and wholeness and beauty and health, but we often don't know how to get there. And what we see, we often just believe. But just because you see something or feel something doesn't make it true. Doesn't make it true. Like if I had a chalkboard and I wrote 2 + 2 = 4, but then next to it I wrote 2 + 2 = 5, you could see both equations just the same. They could be right next to each other. But one would be absolutely true, and the other one would be 100% false. Just like you could see a picture right next to each other, just like you did with the flat earth and then the earth as a sphere. And they're both valid pictures. You saw both of them. But just because you see something doesn't make it true. And what I'm sharing today about Christian Science, it's about getting a higher or more heavenly view of life. And right where experience seems to fall flat, we can begin to see with what you could call spiritual sense, looking and reasoning out from God, wholeness and health and holiness. And if you look up those words in a dictionary, explore their etymology, how words like health and holiness and wholesomeness derived, you'll realize they often derive from kind of that same concept of unity or oneness. And I think real health is holiness. It's really feeling totally at one with life and love. And there's nothing more incredible than that. Now, I'm someone who loves to travel. I've been across to Australia, to the Great Barrier Reefs. I've been up to the Himalayas, and I used to love mountaineering. Today I was exploring a little gadget called a one wheel. It's like a electronic skateboard kind of gadget, and riding all around here in Maine, up in Booth Bay. And yet the greatest adventure in life I think, is to experience God. There's nothing better than it. And this book, I want to share with you this book today because it's the one book that really has helped me experience God more than any other except the Bible. And it's called Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. Now, when I was a kid, I read the Bible. My mom went to a variety of churches. When I got older and went to college, I studied religion because I was obsessed with the idea of experiencing God. But I thought the Bible it talked about so many wonderful things, especially the life of Jesus. I should say parenthetically, a lot of people think the Bible is a lot of kind of rules and regulations, and it kind of makes a burden on you when you read it. And yet Jesus said, "My burden is light," and he talked about making people's lives easier, less full of stress and burden and conflict, and trying to find that love that is really at the core of reality, that is the one life that we're all in and of. And Jesus, he often talked about things in the Old Testament, like you heard this idea of justice, like an eye for an eye, and then he would share something even more deep and profound, a more profound way to live, right out from love, like not responding or reacting to anger or jealousy, or when people do something wrong to you, persecute you, and talked about how to really live out from the life that is love. And this book, Science and Health, with Key to the Scriptures, really helps unlock the spiritual meaning in the Bible, and it helps you begin to perceive life as Jesus did. One of the most wonderful little phrases in the Bible, I think, comes from First Philippians, and it says essentially that we can have the same mind that was also in Christ Jesus, or have the same mind that was also in Christ Jesus. Some translations, like the NIV, says we can have the same mindset that was also in Christ Jesus. And this is what this book does. As you read it, it talks about how to gain that perception of our oneness with God like Jesus had it. Now, I'll share with you a little sentence here that I think is the keynote for this entire book, that really captures what the book is all about. And in fact, it's the very first line. It says, "The prayer that reforms the sinner and heals the sick is an absolute faith that all things are possible to God, a spiritual understanding of Him, and unselfed love." And as I mentioned earlier, that word sin, when I read the Bible, a lot of people are just super turned off to that. I think that word sin, it's an archery term that means off the mark. And I think when we're off the mark in life, it's always because we're not understanding or living out from God enough. We're feeling separate from life, separate from love, separate from some universal truth that allows breakthroughs. I was recently watching a video from a modern inventor, and he invented this incredible invention that caused so much good in people's lives, and yet he talked about doing it because he discovered something true about reality. He was working with eternal principles of mathematics, essentially, and physics. And it was so cool how you could see him working with universal truth caused breakthrough and helped others through his invention. And the author of this book, Mary Baker Eddy, she didn't feel like she invented anything, just like you wouldn't say you invented the laws of physics. She felt like she discovered something. And what she felt that she discovered was Christian Science. And I think today in our scientific world, a lot of times people think, well, religion or Christianity, it's kind of, we're moving away from that because we're looking at life from a scientific viewpoint, which kind of, it's not about religion. And science is always about the patterns and regularities of the material world, and in observing those and building technology that harnesses those patterns and regularities. And yet Jesus, when he saw something that could be explained as a normal pattern of discord or disease or difficulty. When he saw someone ill, for example, and you could explain that illness or perhaps that blindness of that blind man by some kind of valid material theory, Jesus saw what was truly natural is that consciousness of our oneness with God. And as he gained and expressed those higher conscious states of oneness with God, and he saw people from a more heavenly viewpoint, often healing happened. And that appeared like a miracle to someone, just like if people from the past showed up in the present day and saw iPhones and planes and live streams like this, they would think that that's miraculous. But of course, it's all based upon eternal principles of mathematics, physics, and so forth. It's not a mystery. And Mary Baker Eddy, she was someone who was a very scientifically minded thinker, and she felt like everything that was in the Bible, the wonderful healing, it could be explained on the basis of eternal principles. And that's what this book shows you. Now, those three different things, faith, a spiritual understanding, and unselfed love, you could see them as three separate things, but you could also see what are we having trust in? How do we have an absolute faith in God? Well, to really trust God, have an absolute faith, you need to have behind that act of trust an understanding of God and the ability to love without self. Now, absolute faith sounds like a hard thing to garner. Like, how am I going to do that? Have an absolute faith in God. Maybe I'm just barely getting through my day. Well, how do you have an absolute faith that 2 plus 2 equals 4 and zero faith in 2 plus 2 equals 5? It's because you realize that there's an internal logic there that really continually produces good when you apply it in situations, and it's reliable. I think understanding the basis of reality as love itself, truth itself, life itself, these, when brought into our thought and our perception of existence, really reliably bring out health and goodness and so forth. And in fact, in Science and Health, there's this beautiful line that says, it is our ignorance of God, the divine principle, which produces apparent discord, and the right understanding of him restores harmony. The right understanding of God restores harmony. I really see that as the gospel of Christian Science. And those different terms I've been bringing out, there are a few others in Science and Health. It defines God as incorporeal, divine, supreme, infinite mind, spirit, soul, principle, life, truth, love. And some of those other terms like principle, that means like something you can't explain in terms of anything else. And a lot of philosophers, they're exploring this idea of consciousness perhaps being fundamental to life right now, because if you study philosophy at all, this is a discussion that's been going on throughout the ages but has erupted in our present age, because even hardcore atheists, they can't explain how one can be conscious of life from any materialistic paradigm. If you picture it, if you think of the human body as just a mere machine, a biological machine, if you created a robot that tried to mimic everything that's in the human body, and there were just ones and zeros and switches, there'd be no reason, even if that was extremely complicated, to think that if there was a lot of ones and zeros, all of a sudden there's conscious life. That's just a miraculous leap, right? There's no explanation there. And David Chalmers, the philosopher, talks about that as the hard problem of consciousness. Well, Mary Baker Eddy, she begins with this idea of consciousness just being fundamental to life. It's just another way of thinking about that oneness behind everything. It's consciousness, it's love, it's truth, the other words she uses, spirit, soul, right? And all these words have really infinite depth to them and can help you understand life from a different angle. And when it clicks, that life is love, this love is like a principle that's fundamental to existence, That principle is soul, the source of all beauty, continuity. That one principle behind everything, it's spirit, it's meaning the opposite of matter. When you make those kind of breakthroughs, a healing often ensues. And so let me just share you an example along these lines, and it's a tiered example. There's a few different healings kind of packed into one here. I had a friend some years ago who was looking for a home in a little small town, and I was in the same little small town. We were both searching for a place to live, and I know a lot of people right now are searching for home. Some of the folks from the sponsoring branch who are hosting this talk, they were struggling with homelessness in their community, feeling like there are a lot of people without a home. And my friend was searching for a home at the time. He didn't have a lot of money, couldn't find a good place to live. I had the same situation. We felt like rent was really high in this little area. And after a long, arduous search, we eventually landed on a place that we thought was great. And I remember thinking, the one thing I don't like about this apartment is that there's like paper thin walls. And I was like, whoever moves next door, I better be friendly with them. And it turns out that it was this individual I already knew. And we became even better friends when we found out we were neighbors there. And we were going through a difficult time in our life. Both of us were breaking up with girlfriends we had dated for many, many years. And I remember in one moment, late night, deep discussion we were having, I just said, maybe you should go and try to win back your girlfriend. And I was just sharing with him some just kind of senseless advice, really. And he said, you know what I think I should actually do? I should read that book that you gave me, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. He said, I think the answers are in there. And as he started to read that book, what I observed was that side of us, within our life, within our consciousness. And it's like this little thing out there that we think is the cause of our happiness or love. But this book was making my friend pivot from a material standpoint, and that's what materialism means, is that life and consciousness and goodness, it's in a box, or it's in a body, it's in a thing, right? It has parameters. It's imprisoned. It's not universal. It's not everywhere. Right? Love is it's caused by something, right, in life. And he was pivoting from that to starting from that standpoint that life is God. He's in and of this life. And the opposite of materiality is spirituality. And what Christian Science shows is that as we express God, we start to see more God around us. In other words, as we express love, we start to see more love around us. And instead of trying to get love, if we want to feel life is love and understand that more, we need just to express it at all times. And as we do that, we realize that there's no end to it. Like, you don't love and love and love and then say, okay, I'm all out of love now. Because love is infinite. It's eternal. It's not based or produced by time and matter in some configuration within our life or within consciousness. It is consciousness. It is our life. And this is at the heart of this understanding of Christian Science. It's this universal, eternal vision of what God is and how to bring that into our life. And so as my friend started to read about this and take it on board, it really started to open up this world more bright, this heaven on earth kind of thing. And he was able to go through that really difficult breakup with a real measure of grace. And he was able to move into his life more happily and joyfully. And fast forward a couple of years, he was actually living with me now in a big city, and he got into a really difficult car accident. And it seemed like there was perhaps some internal injuries. He was going to go off to a hospital, but I was able to go there and help him come back to my apartment. And that seemed like a small miracle in itself, because the folks who got there wanted to rush him off to the hospital. But it just seemed right for him to step back. He wanted to get that higher view of his life and see his life as whole and harmonious, like Jesus would have saw him at that time. Now, Jesus, his life brought this incredible comfort to people's everyday experience. People would meet him and they just felt so at home and whole and loved. That's certainly what I get reading biblical accounts. And yet Jesus, when he was moving on and leaving the earth for good, he said, "I will send you another comforter." And when Mary Baker Eddy really uncovered the divine logic behind Jesus' life, Christian Science, she really felt that was a fulfillment to that prophetic word of Jesus there, that promise and intuition that he really knew that something else would come to further this goodness. Because I would say, in light of these teachings, that progress is the law of God, that things always continue and unfold more good as we continue through life. And so that sense of comfort, it certainly came to my friend as we started to read this book along with the Bible and started to pray with ideas in it. And I won't tell you the whole story, but within a few days, it was just a few days, he was back at work like nothing really ever happened. And he was so moved by that transformation that he could share that with any person and show how efficacious Christian Science healing is. Now, fast forward a few more years. Now, this same friend called me out of the blue and he said, "Hey, Nate, can we pray about teeth? Is that something fair game?" And I said, "Oh, yeah." In fact, you could have filled in any noun there, and he could have said, "Can I pray about cars, relationships, employment, health," whatever it was. I could have said, "Yeah, we can pray about that," because prayer is just aligning our thought to God. And wherever we are in life, whatever we're thinking about, there's always a more heavenly or godly way to consider what we're thinking about. There's a higher view. Now, what he was thinking about was a dental problem. This is what he wrote about this experience. This is from his own words. He said, "I had been going to the dentist for years and was told each time that I needed a root canal because my tooth was dead and discolored. The only other option was to have it pulled." Now, like a lot of folks right now, my friend was a young lad. He was in between jobs. He didn't have a lot of money. And he didn't want to pay for this out of the pocket. But I think there was something even deeper going on. Because I think he understood that Christian Science healing doesn't just affect what's on the surface. And if you ever see a commercial for drugs on the TV, it'll show somebody prancing through the wheat fields with the light glistening on the person's back, and it'll say all the good things this drug can do, but then at the end it'll say, but also may cause all this bad stuff. And in human life, often when we poke and prod things, we can affect, it's like you make one change, but then other changes ensue. And it's like a game of whack-a-mole. You whack one mole down and another one comes up somewhere else. And Christian Science healing, it's really this incredible holistic, whole person healing, because it renovates the way we're viewing life. And then everything within consciousness and within our life we start to experience it brighter and more beautiful. And it's kind of like, I live on this oceanic river here when I'm up in Maine, and when the tides come up, every boat in the river comes up with the tides. There's not one that stays down below. And when we lift our thought to God, all of our thoughts and our vision of life in every arena of life, it's natural for it to be uplifted. Since consciousness is unitary, it's just one thing. It's about the oneness of life. As we lift up our view of things, our overall view, everything else is affected there. And so as I was starting to pray with my friend about this tooth issue, we started to think about him, certainly I did, as belonging to this one life. Now, often people think about life and death as opposites, right? A death of a tooth is natural. Everything that lives dies. And life is the opposite of death. Death is the opposite of life. And people often see life in terms of those kind of that duality, and in every aspect of life, like light and darkness, good and bad. But the Bible, the main theme that runs throughout it is this idea of monotheism, one God, one source to things. And it describes that source as light itself, as love itself. Now, just let's take light and dark as an example, as opposites. They seem like opposites, right? Half your day is in light, half is in dark. If you represent them as colors, it's like white and black. They're total opposites. And yet, light is not the opposite of dark. Darkness is just what we call the absence of light. If you look up at the night sky, you see vast darkness all around, maybe some pinpricks of starlight. But if you talk to an astronomer, they would tell you, oh, the whole universe is flooded with light. Light is everywhere, but the human eye is not sensitive enough to see it. So in the same way, I think love is everywhere, but sometimes we're not sensitive enough to see it if we're looking at life from a materialistic vantage point. But as soon as we start to look at life out from spirit, out from God, we can begin naturally to perceive that love is everywhere. Now, the same is true with life. Often we see death like it's the opposite of life, but no, that's just our inability to see life in a certain circumstance. Like I used to do documentary work, and I did a year-long documentary about miracles. And when I did that documentary, I recorded a lot of people's stories who had near-death or after-death experiences. And to the human eye, to human witnesses, a lot of these stories were depicted as someone dying, and they saw the dead person on the floor or an operating room. But to the person's own experience, who had apparently died, they would, once coming back and reviving, they would talk about just being elsewhere and usually having a wonderful experience. And that makes me think that consciousness is eternal, right? And they were experiencing love in a wonderful way too, and usually in those experiences. Now, I think consciousness doesn't die, and nor do any of us, nor does any idea of God, you could say. And I think we are ideas of God. And as I started to pray for my friend, I started to think about him as the very expression of God, infinite life, the very Son of God, infinite life. And his birthright was life and goodness, and death was not the opposite of life, but he was the very living manifestation of life. Now, an analogy that helps bring this home to me is Jesus talked about himself as the light of the world, but he didn't think just he was the light of the world. He said people who followed him, his disciples, were the light of the world as well. Now, if you take that analogy and you see a light beam come through the trees, what is that light beam? You could say that that light beam is the living, brand new expression of the sun. It has just one source, one cause, doesn't have multiple causes, multiple sources, just one. And without going into all the physics of it, you could say that light beam is made brand new as the expression of the sun every moment. And if you put your hand up to a light beam for a long time, take it down, that light beam is shining brand new because it's brand new out from its source every moment. I think this is a wonderful way to think about our own identity. What are the expressions of life, of God? One thing, just like a light beam is the expression of the sun. Now, what's really interesting about this analogy, where it gets really crisp to our understanding of life and can help us move from a materialistic vision of life to a spiritual one, is in the following. We often think about ourselves as defined by what people have said or what we've said, by physical imagery, things that we've seen about ourselves, and what other people have seen about us, and how the world has tried to box us in as this age, from this part of town, with this reputation, this vocational history, and so forth. And yet, if you think of that light beam coming through the trees, if you said something to a light beam, if you said, hey, we have an X-ray and you've got a bad, light ray right here, and it's dead, that would affect the light beam not at all, right? What if you showed him a picture of it? You took this photograph of, it really looks like, your light beam is dying. I haven't seen it today. It's been cloudy. And you tried to show him that image. Would it affect that light beam at all? No. If you tried to physically manipulate it, try to put a pill or a vaccine in that light beam, would it change its inherent nature? No. Because it's defined and made out of the sun every moment, and it's not defined by what you say materially or do materially to it. And it's not defined by putting it into a box. In other words, if you literally put that light beam into a box, brought it into another room, opened it up, could it be boxed in? Would it be in that box? No. It's because it's something new every moment from the sun. It's not defined by how it shined a moment ago, right? And I was starting to think about my friend along these lines, that he was the expression of life, brand new every moment, that his nature was not defined by what someone said or a physical image. Again, there was an X-ray of this dead tooth, and yet that wasn't the image of God. The very first chapter of Genesis, the very first thing in the Bible, it says that we are the image and likeness of God. And I started to think about himself as that. I started to really reflect on that. And as I did, I started to feel this deep oneness, this deep wholeness, unity with life and love. And I started to feel that my friend was a unified idea. If you think about numbers, like the number 4 or 5 or 6, it's a whole number, right? It has a perfect identity. It doesn't grow up to be what it is. Number 5 doesn't go up through 3 and 4 and then find its niche. And then over time, it doesn't droop down to a different number or identity. It's just stable and it's eternal. It has its perfect niche in reality, and it's not subject to birth or decay. In the same way, I think our true spiritual identity is something that transcends material imagery, material words, material, materialism altogether, any box. And as I was praying in that way, I started to feel that sense of heaven within. Jesus said, the kingdom of heaven is within us. Don't look here or there. It's within us. It's within us because it's consciousness. It's the consciousness of God. That's what heaven is. That's all that heaven could ever be. And, some people talk about hell or the afterlife being like you would be defined by some physical place. And I always think that, that's such an immature idea because, I've been to the most idyllic places on earth, and if I'm in a bad mood, I can be in hell. And I've been to some of the most boring places. I've been literally like inside of a closet praying, and I've felt so wonderful, the most wonderful feelings on earth when I've really started to perceive life out from God. And so it's not where we physically are that defines us. Psalm 139 says, if I make my bed in hell, thou art there. God is here. So that repudiates the idea that hell could be a physical place, because hell really is just the absence of God. Well, I could harken on that for a long time. If you look up the biblical words for heaven and hell, I mean, it's just kind of imagery, I think, mostly for conscious states. It's so clear. And well, as I was praying for my friend's tooth issue there, we just started to just think so much about his life being eternal, and we really studied those words. People often talk about being students of Christian Science because it's something we study. We're trying to learn more about God and life, because the right understanding of God restores harmony. And as I did that, I just started to feel that wonderful sense of sublime peace and unity with God that's often indicative of healing. Often it reveals that we're on the right track. And what happened later was that, I'll just to finish this story, my friend wrote, the day after we spoke and prayed about it, I went into the dentist and he and all the nurses were baffled. They looked at the x-ray from before, the ones taken that day. They looked into my mouth. They said that that tooth looked perfectly healthy, and I was fine. Nothing further was needed. They said that they had never seen anything like it before in all their years of dentistry. And what was so cool was that that image of his tooth seemed to be substantial. A lot of times people will look at an image of something and they'll think, well, that's substance. That's, matter is substance. This is a picture of matter. But, if you ask somebody on their deathbed, what is substantial in their life, they'll explain moments of love or talk about moments of love, of unity, of oneness, of really feeling whole. And interestingly, that word substance is correlated with the word understanding. They're both really saying the same thing. Substance, understanding. They're about what are we standing on mentally? What is our substance? And the theologian Paul Tillich talked about the ground of being. And I remember some years ago, I was going through a difficult time in my life, and I decided to take a literal kind of isolation experience. A lot of people right now have been struggling with isolation, and it's been a part of the spiritual journey throughout the ages of people desiring and taking times of isolation to really reflect on God. And I took a 40 days in the wilderness kind of experience. The first 20 days I went alone out to an island on the biggest lake in Maine. And I just decided since I was going through a really tough time and struggling with understanding God, I would read the whole Bible. And I'm sorry, the whole New Testament. And I did that in 10 days. And for the next 10 days, I just prayed about my life and the world. And at the end of those 20 days, I felt like I was riding a high. I felt like I was on this spiritual high. And yet, as I was riding back, a big storm came, and the rain started to flood down upon my, from the sky. And it started to come down. And just it felt like a very cinematic moment. I all of a sudden, just out of nowhere, just started to weep, just like the big raindrops coming down on me. And I was surprised because I had thought I was over this difficult situation I was dealing with in my personal life. I thought I had overcome it. I thought I really felt that oneness with love, and I was ready to move forward. But those tears just started to come down uncontrollably. And all of a sudden, as I was paddling there, it just hit me like a lightning bolt. Everything I had been read in the New Testament, the spirit of it, and especially this little phrase came to thought. And the phrase was at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. If you haven't read your Bible in a while, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, wonderful place to start. And at the end of chapter 7, Jesus, he says, essentially, if you build your life on my teachings, on my view of the world, it's like building on the rock. This is our substance, our understanding of things. If you build your life on the way I'm showing you how to understand it, I think he was saying it's like building on the rock. And when the winds and the rain of life come, you won't be moved. It's not going to knock down your house, not going to move your consciousness, so to speak, because you're grounded on what's true and eternal and stable. That's infinite life, love, and truth. And I think that's what he was getting at. But the phrase that he says essentially is that if you build your life, if you build your house on the rock, it won't get knocked down with the wind and the waves. And I just felt that all of a sudden, like when I was paddling there, that I'm grounded on the rock of goodness, of God. I could never be without love. I could never be without life. I could never be without soul, creativity and goodness. I could never be absent from any good. God is good itself. And all of a sudden, I just felt so firm in love and goodness. And a moment I felt that the tears went away, and I think that was almost 20 years ago now, I think. And I just have never felt that kind of instability ever since. I've certainly had my share of happy tears and sad tears, but I've just never felt that sense of just kind of crying without control, just feeling that life is out of my hands in a way that's just horrible, that things are just bad and there's no way to fix them. Never felt that way ever since then. I've just always felt, in the words of this book, Science and Health, perfection underlies reality. Without perfection, nothing is wholly real. And Jesus said to us, be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect, in the Sermon on the Mount. And I think he was saying, perfection is like in number. It's based on something being eternal. I think what Jesus was getting at was understand yourself spiritually, because God is spirit. Understand yourself from the standpoint of having an eternal spiritual existence, something that's beyond birth and death. And when you do that, that's when you'll find freedom. A member of this church was telling me that a lot of people are thinking about freedom right now under lockdown. What is freedom even? And Jesus said, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And my friend with that tooth issue, when he said the day after we spoke and prayed about it, I went into the dentist, and he and all the nurses were baffled. They looked at the x-ray from before, the ones taken that day. They looked into my mouth, and they said that tooth looked perfectly healthy, and I was fine. Nothing further was needed. They said they had never seen anything like it before in all their years of dentistry. And my friend experienced that stability in that circumstance, that rooting in good, that perfection, just like I eventually instantaneously felt it when I was paddling that day. And, a healing like that can't just be wiped away through some mere psychosomatic or physicalist perspective. A lot of people, in our modern age, read the Bible and they think, well, there must be some, ways to explain that healing that Jesus did in a way that could make sense with our materialistic paradigm. And some people say, well, a lot of it is just myth, and maybe there's some mind over matter, like people do kind of crazy things under hypnosis and that sort of stuff. And but Christian Science reveals that there's really a better and more thorough explanation to the healing that we see in the Bible and the healing that's happening around the world through Christian Science practice today. And it's understanding that life is fundamentally spiritual. You're not going to have this kind of healing consistently unless you understand that you have a spiritual identity. And years ago, when I was doing this documentary about miracles, I recorded people from all different walks of life, all different faiths. And at that time, I was pretty new to Christian Science. And I kept thinking, well, there's got to be another religion or spiritual sect that can explain the miracles in the Bible in a way that is natural, and the miracles that have happened in all different religions. And yet I just kept coming back to Christian Science, and the Christian scientists who I met kept having the most wonderful stories, but those wonderful healing accounts were correlated with this deep and thorough understanding of life that talked about miracles as not supernatural, but supernatural, the most natural thing in the world, really the fulfillment of spiritual law, the understanding of our oneness with life, truth, and love. Now, if you read Science and Health, you're going to want to know more about the life of its author, Mary Baker Eddy. Her life was really just, an extraordinary thing to read about, because she was someone for the first half of her life, up into basically age 44 or so, just riddled with difficulty. She had ill health for the most of her life up until that point. And yet she had a kind of amazing ability to pray and heal, but it seemed kind of sporadic, right? It would happen sometimes, not others. And later in her life, when she discovered Christian Science and she really understood the basis of healing, she became just an amazing and consistent healer from that point on. And this book called Christian Healer catalogs over 300 healing experiences that came through her prayers. And it's a wonderful read. If you've never read this book, I really hope you do. And she healed everything from just everyday broken hearts to broken bones. And she healed people who had cancer in its last stages, and people who are blind and born deaf and born crippled. She prayed for people and like that, and some of them had really profound healing experiences. And one of the things about this book, like many of other biographies about her that you might read, that you hear about people who met her and they said that they never felt more loved in their life. And there was someone named Harriet O'Brien from Kansas City in America, and she had a life just riddled with issues. She had chronic heart issues, chronic spine issues. She picked up what's called an iatrogenic ailment, something caused by medical intervention that went awry. And she was relegated to a wheelchair. She got so sick that she felt like she was about to pass on. She had people around the clock, looking after her. And was so sick at that point that she lost the ability to speak and think correctly. And it was at that point she was introduced to Christian Science. And she started to have someone who was a practitioner, somebody studying and practicing Christian Science full time, pray for her. And within a short period, she was well. Now, you could imagine after a turnaround like that she might want to meet Mary Baker Eddy. Parenthetically, Mary Baker Eddy lived from 1821 until 1910, and Harriet O'Brien was alive when Mary Baker Eddy was. And so Harriet O'Brien really wanted to meet Mary Baker Eddy. And when she did, this is what she wrote about that remarkable experience. She said, "Transparency is the word that best expresses my impression of Mrs. Eddy. Instinctively, I felt her great love, and I was conscious that no one I had ever seen loved me as much as she did. My entire thought was filled with a spiritual illumination, and there was a glory in the sunshine and landscape as though a breath of heaven had swept earth and enveloped me." Now, if I was her, I probably would have said, okay, I know where I'm going to be tomorrow morning. I'm going to get another dose of that Mary Baker Eddy. And yet, consistently, this is not what Mary Baker Eddy brought out in other people's experience. She didn't have the desire for personal worship. In fact, Jesus, when someone said to him, "Good master," he couldn't even get someone to get past that sentence. He said, "There's only one good, that is God." And he just constantly directed people back to God and outside of his physical personality. In fact, his expression of God or life was so clear and transparent, non-personal, impersonal, that when people met him, there's nothing recorded in the Bible about how tall or small he was or what color eyes he had. His spirituality eclipsed physicality. People didn't walk away talking about physical things or physicality. They walked away talking about God. And when people met Mary Baker Eddy, following in Jesus' footsteps, she had a very similar effect on people. She got people talking and thinking about God. And she wrote in this book, Science and Health, that the intercommunication is always from God to his idea, man, which means all of us. And her whole quest in life was for people to get to understand God directly. And Harriet O'Brien, when she met Mary Baker Eddy, she said she had a question in her heart, and the question was, can I be a healer too? And she said the moment she met Mary Baker Eddy, and this is without any words being exchanged, she said that question was answered. And she hopped back on a train shortly after, went back to her hometown, Kansas City, and promptly started a public practice of Christian Science. And she advertised as a professional healer for over 50 years and left a long legacy of healing. And she said on several occasions she helped people she helped raise people from their apparent deathbed to find a life of health and goodness. And all through prayer alone. So I just love that. I love that. And I know that anyone, I've seen this, people start to read this book all around the world, all different career backgrounds, all different, first languages. And reading this book has helped everyday people become healers. I don't think healing is a gift like some Christians talk about it, or some just everyday people think about it. I think spiritual healing is about revealing that perfection that underlies reality. It's not about changing anything. It's actually just about getting rid of our materialistic beliefs. It's like wiping a mirror and that it seems to be dirty, and then all of a sudden seeing this bright, beautiful world outside. But we're not creating that world outside, that beauty. We're just starting to clean our mental lens and stop seeing life as boxed in, as materialized, as caused by matter. But it's caused by divine consciousness, divine love, divine life. As we understand that more deeply, we start to feel love with us all the time. We start to experience a deathless, continuous good in our experience, even when we seem to be going through very difficult times on the surface. We can feel that sense of stability and start to experience more and more healing. Well, before I continue here, I think this is a good point just to pause and see what questions have come in and see what I can do to answer them. And if you haven't asked a question yet, you're welcome to ask one. Okay, someone said here, I am having trouble, and that passage. Okay, so how many people are? Let me just read through this because it's quite long and has some personal details. Yeah, someone was talking about just their life seems to have a lot of difficulty in it, and I think they were referring to that passage with the blind man, and they thought it was cruel that someone was born blind, and I think yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you can see horrible things in the world sometimes that seem unjust. And just like those disciples, you might think, well, what caused this? I mean, they were blaming uh, the person. It said, is it the person or the father who sinned that this person is blind? Well, some people just think, well, when bad things happen, they blame God, or they blame life. And they just think, well, life is bad or God is bad if this bad thing has happened. And Jesus pivoted and said, this is the reason why this good thing is going to happen. Now, I don't think he was just being blind to the bad stuff, but I think he understood that when we see something that's wrong in life, it's literally wrong, like 2 + 2 = 5. It doesn't have a principle behind it. It doesn't have God behind it. It doesn't have love behind it. And so when you see stuff that is wrong, it's not that there's a cause of that wrongness. Like you could say, what caused 2 + 2 = 5? Because, I was building a house and I kept putting 2 + 2 = 5 into my calculations, and this house is falling down. And look at how horrible this is, that I spent all this money and it's fallen down. It's not worth anything. Who created 2 + 2 = 5? I'm going to get to them, right? Well, nobody created 2 + 2 = 5. And why were you thinking that it was valid and that you should use it when you were building your house? I think that's no different to say that if you see bad things in the world, why are you thinking about that and building a worldview around that, and then being surprised if your life seems to fall down flat? Well, Christian Science shows us that we need to build on good principles, build on a good vision of life based on God. And as we do that, we start to find that life is not inherently cruel, that people aren't just bad, right? We start to really uncover goodness everywhere in life. And it's a very humble activity. Jesus gave a lot of parables talking about how just cherishing little goodness can transform something that seems to be big, like a little bit of yeast in bread can transform and change the nature of bread. Or talked about a little mustard seed growing into up to this huge, beautiful tree that causes comfort for the inhabitants of the natural world. And so, just humbly cherishing spiritual truth and our oneness with God and the nature of God, that can really transform our life and reveal that really cruelty has nothing to do with life at all. Okay, so let's see what other questions have come in. Someone says, thank you. I've had other questions, but I've had questions, but they've already been answered in the lecture. Someone was asking about the year-long documentary that I did. It's no longer online, but I will see when this is posted if I can share some clips with you about that. Yeah, there was some wonderful stories there. Maybe I can share a few with you. Okay, someone else asked a question. How can we pray about workers being forced to choose between having a job and getting a vaccine? Some workplaces are indicating that they may not give work to those not vaccinated. Some people at my work are so against it that they fear they won't have a job if they don't have it, but will get sick if they do. Others don't want to get it for religious or political reasons. Yeah, it's interesting. I was thinking about something similar recently with Jesus and taxes, which was just kind of another issue that kind of a world government was streaming to impose on individuals. And some people feel that, a government is forcing me to do this, or I have to do this to get a job. And, Jesus, when he was talking about taxes, this is in Matthew 17, it says, Jesus and his disciples arrived in Capernaum, and the collectors of the tax came to Peter and asked, "Doesn't your teacher pay to the temple tax?" "Yes, he does," he replied. When Peter came into the house, Jesus was first to speak. "What do you think, Simon?" he asked. "From whom do the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes? From their own sons or from others?" "From others," Peter answered. "Then the sons are exempt," Jesus said to them. "But so that we may not offend them, go to the lake and throw out your line and take the fish and what you catch, and you will get a coin. Take it and give it to them for my tax and yours." And I paraphrased a little bit of that. But Jesus, he talked about not offending these folks and kind of a suffer it to be so now kind of thing. And he was able to pay that tax, but in a way that was kind of a wonderful apparent miracle on the surface right there. And, that one of the things I love about Christian Science is that it doesn't push us into any political direction or any kind of one side of a divisive issue. Jesus really was non-political. He lived in a time when the Roman Empire was just a behemoth, overcame the Greeks, Babylonians, and now the Jews were under Roman occupation. And yet Jesus didn't become a king and fight for freedom on a governmental level or on a level of just bloodshed, violence. He instead saw a spiritual answer, an answer that was much more humble and actually took more time. But of course, the Roman Empire fell, and Jesus' teachings are alive and well today and transforming the world, continuing to do so. And when we look at little issues like this, things that the government isn't making us do, or perhaps our employer making us do, we might find a way to compromise. We might find a way that something can work for everyone. In this book, one of the little phrases I love is, "What blesses one blesses all." And we can find something that really is good for us that can be good for another. And there's always a solution that blesses everybody, that brings people together. But it often takes deep, humble love. And Jesus, different times in his ministry, he said, "Suffer it to be so now," in certain circumstances. He wasn't dogmatic, like just, "I'm going to do this no matter what." In fact, when when he was in isolation, Matthew 4, and the devil told him to jump off a high temple. He didn't just do it because he thought, well, all things are possible with God. I'll show you, devil. No, he did what was wise, and he just he didn't try to force anything. And sometimes wisdom comes to us in different ways. It can be wise to withhold from something. It can be wise to make a compromise in a certain circumstance. And so with an issue like a vaccine, it's wonderful that Christian Science Church doesn't make any strong stand saying every member should do this or should do that. It's left to the wisdom of the individual, and you might come to different conclusions at different times. And so, there's no hard and fast answer here to your question, but I think one that's key is just to feel moved by God, moved by love, love for God and love for humanity, for those around you. And sometimes, the answer is, it actually is prayer. It's not yes or no to a question. It's you pray about something, and then all of a sudden, a new vision of things can occur to you. I've had that so many times where it seems like you're between a rock and a hard place. You have two options in life, and you pray about something, and you're just led to good in a different way altogether. It's like, oh, I have to do this for my job or that for my job, and then all of a sudden it's just, call this person, and you call them, and they offer you a different job, or to open yourself up to God. It's to open up to infinite good, and the solutions that come might be even counterintuitive on the surface, but will bring more freedom, more love, more connection, more goodness. All right, so let's see if any other questions came in. I think there is one more here. Let me look through. Not there. Okay, I'm just going to check on YouTube. I don't see another one, but someone did ask me earlier about just some of the more difficult passages in the Bible. Like what about some of the really violent stuff in the Old Testament? They were saying, do you accept all of the Bible as a Christian Scientist? And one of the things I love about Christian Science is it talks about the inspired word of the Bible. We take the inspired word of the Bible. And the Bible is written by many different people in many different economic and cultural places, and it was written over a large span of time. And I really see the Bible as, every chapter in the Bible has wonderful glimpses of spiritual truth, but there is also a kind of evolution throughout it. It starts off with a kind of a wonderful thesis statement that Genesis 1 is this beautiful poem about the true essence of life. And then some of the books of the Bible, you get history books, books of poetry, prophetic visions of how things are going to be better in the future, many books of the prophets. But it culminates in this wonderful revealing of the Christ in this individual called Jesus. And Jesus really fully kind of finally opens the veil and shows you this just wonderful, pure, totally pure sense of life and love. And although you get glimpses of it in the Old Testament, you don't experience the fullness of Christ, that voice or communication of God, until you get to Jesus. And so when I read the Old Testament, I read many little glimpses. There are many different inspiring spiritual anecdotes and really a lot of pure experiences of God, but it's often mixed in with a lot of cultural stuff. And in Jesus himself, he took Old Testament things like, you've heard it, an eye for an eye, but I tell you, when someone does something bad to you, offer good in return, essentially is what he says. And, if someone asks you for a coat, give them two, right? Jesus lifted us up higher to this ideal of pure, unselfed love. And so when I read the Bible, the Old Testament, it's building up to this grand vision, this true vision of life and love that's fully revealed in Jesus. But even the New Testament, it's pretty short. It kind of leads you to think that there's more. Jesus said, "I will send you another comforter." And when I first read this book, like a lot of people around the world, I started to feel like, wow, this explains more. It picks up where the Bible left off, and it brings out the discovery of this scientific universal knowledge of God that Jesus fully embodied. Jesus fully had it. He showed it to us. But this book helps us understand more about God and more about how to apply that understanding of God to our life in a way that's not just blind faith, but in a way that's really based on a universal understanding, and that's based on our ability to express love in a way that's not reserved in any way. And that brings me back to that line that we started this lecture with, the prayer that reforms the sinner and heals the sick. It's an absolute faith that all things are possible to God, a spiritual understanding of Him, and unselfed love. And sometimes people will hear me give a lecture like this, and they'll ask me at the very end, well, what about the words you say when you pray? I mean, is there a formula to prayer? I mean, what do you actually say when you pray? And prayer, it's an adventure. There's so many different ways to pray. There's an infinite amount of ways to pray. There's a lot of wonderful examples of how to pray in the Bible. Jesus gives an example prayer in Matthew 6. Most people call the Lord's Prayer. But he said pray in this manner. It wasn't pray just these words all the time. It gives you a basis for how to pray. And there are many wonderful prayers in the Bible, like the Psalms, these songs for God, like Psalm 23, 91, 139, some of my favorites. And so there are a lot of words that are in the Bible. The Bible is talking about the Word of God, the Word of truth, as well as in this book that you can ponder and think about. And that's a wonderful basis for prayer. But prayer is about our relationship with life, with love, with truth. And in any relationship, you can't just say words that magically make that relationship amazing and complete. Like if you think about someone you love and someone you asked you, well, what words do you say to them that would afford a perfect relationship? Well, it's a weird question. There's no words that would automatically make that relationship perfect. But there are certain words like I love you, I'm grateful for you, that express gratitude and affection that are a good start. That are like samples for kind of what to say. But of course, a perfect relationship it goes beyond words. It's about our attitude. It's about our commitment to the person. And when we think about God, Jesus talked about God in terms of a relationship, something we have a relationship to. And when I think about life, truth, and love and how to have a relationship to it, I think about, well, what makes a great relationship is absolute faith. Having an absolute faith in somebody, really being there for someone, that's a basis for a good relationship. Just like Jesus with his disciples had an absolute faith in them. Who was he resurrecting to? A bunch of people who had just denied him on his darkest hour. And yet, why did he come back? You could only describe that as love. You could only describe it as someone who had an absolute faith in these people. Because Jesus came back to these everyday people and said, you can do it. You can do the things that I've done and even greater. He told them earlier. And he had an absolute trust in them. Well, yeah, if you have an absolute trust in someone, that's going to make for a great relationship. But what if you don't understand them at all? That's not going to be very helpful. To really have a great relationship, you need to understand who they are. And understanding takes listening, it takes quality time. And the same is true with God. To understand God, we need to spend time thinking about God, studying the Bible, and Science and Health are a wonderful place to learn more about how we can understand God's nature. Christian Science really does reveal the nature of God in a universal way and really unpacks that for us. And then, what's a relationship without love? It's nothing at all. Like 1 Corinthians 13 talks about, we might have, wonderful faith and all sorts of good Christian qualities, but if we don't have love, we're nothing. And so, love, it is life. It is God. If we don't have love, we've missed the boat. And so, to think about a good relationship, it's really about love. And love, again, is unity. It's oneness, right? That's prayer, understanding oneness and our oneness with God and others. And so to think about, as we pray, it's about having that absolute faith that's based on understanding and love. And that's what this book is all about. So I hope you get a copy of this. If you don't have a copy of this book, you can jump on christianscience.com. That's a place to check out. There's also what's called JSH.christianscience.com. That stands for Journal, Sentinel, Herald. Those are magazines put out by the Christian Science Church, and those magazines catalog wonderful articles and publish wonderful different editorials and written pieces. And they're starting to do videos and other things that are just from everyday people all around the world putting this science to work. On christianscience.com, you can listen to continuous audio of this book, Science and Health, for free. I often do that. That's a great little feature, and there are just so many more features to expand your journey on Christian Science. Well, I talked today a little bit about opposites and how life appears to be, in terms of opposites, life and death, light and dark, good and bad. And there's this little idiom in American culture that about a glass being half full. Like if you have a glass that's half full of water, this one's a little more than half full. And if you focus on that water, then you're analogous to a positive thinker. But if you saw a glass of water and you would say, oh, I'm looking at the empty part, why isn't it filled to the brim there? And you focused on the emptiness in this cup, then you would be a negative thinker. And some people think that religion is nothing more than just positive thinking. And if I saw a cup of water like this, if this is a cup of water in my house, if this was the only water that I knew that I had, I would be worried no matter how much water was in this cup. And some people, no matter how many good things or bad things in their life, they get worried because they don't know where the source of goodness comes from, the source of just like in my house, if I didn't know I had an infinite tap that I could go over there and turn it on at any moment, I would be nervous about the amount of water in my cup. So it doesn't matter how much good or bad we see on the surface. It matters where is the source of, in this case, water, but in the analogy, where's the source of good in our lives? And when we talk about well-being, which is another way we talk about health, I think it's a beautiful word, well-being. Jesus was once by a well, and he talked to a Samaritan woman. This woman had been married many times by all accounts of the day. She seemed to be a quote-unquote sinner. And yet, Jesus just embraced this individual in total love, like he saw everyone. I think he saw everyone as analogous to like numbers in the number system. Like every number in the number system has a perfect niche. You pluck out, 1,632. Every banking system in the world would collapse if you plucked that idea out of reality. Not a material representation of that number, but the actual idea of it, so no one could think it or represent it. Well, if you did that, every banking system in the world would collapse, world economy would collapse, and yet I think we are more valuable to God than any number is. And I think Jesus, he embraced this Samaritan woman in absolute love, knowing she was a unique, beautiful idea of God. And Jesus essentially said to her that what I'm sharing is like a wellspring of water that once you take in, digest, it wells up within you to eternal life. And I found that what Jesus offered as his perspective in the Bible, and this book, Science and Health, Minds for Inspiration, is this eternal wellspring of goodness that's within us. It's the kingdom of heaven. It's this source of good that never runs out. It's God itself. And so I hope you got just a little glimpse of that today, true health, true well-being. And I hope you continue your journey exploring Christian Science. Again, I want to thank the sponsors of this event. First Church of Christ Scientist in Ringwood, Victoria, Australia. Those church members are just such wonderful people. And again, I thank them for sponsoring this talk. To close, I just want to share with you that you are loved. I think that all of us are not only expressions of God, divine love, but that we're made to feel love, and we're made to be extremely lovable and good. We are the expression of divine love itself. So I hope you feel loved right now, and I hope you learned something today about this science of divine love. Thank you so very much.